The wind had a way of speaking out on the Wyoming frontier, low, hollow, and endless, like something ancient wandering the plains, searching for a door left open. Most nights that wind curled around the Brennan Ranch house, brushing against the windows till it found even the smallest crack to slip through, whispering into the empty rooms as if it were calling for someone who would never answer again. Thomas Brennan, known simply as Tom by the locals, heard it every night. Ever since the ground had swallowed his wife beneath a blanket of winter soil, the sound had become part of him. She had died fast, fever, shivers, and a storm that cut off every road for help. Just like that, life cracked into two pieces, before and after. And after was a cold that no fire could keep outside. He lived with his little girl Josie, inside a house that once smelled of biscuits, lavender soap, and someone humming without even realizing she was doing it. Now the air smelled of dust, wet wood, and the kind of silence that pressed against your chest. Tom did what men were expected to do: wake early, feed the livestock, mend fences, mend saddles, mend anything that broke. He fixed everything on that land except the one thing he didn't know how to fix: the space between him and his daughter. Josie was only 8, but she carried herself like someone older, someone who had already learned the world could take people without warning. She didn't cry loud like some children. She cried soft, like she didn't want to bother anyone, especially her father. They shared a table, shared the same air, even shared memories, yet they sat like two travelers waiting for different trains. Sometimes during breakfast, Tom would try to speak. "How's your sleep?" "It was fine." And that was all. It wasn't anger. It wasn't blame. It was simply distance, shaped by grief that neither knew how to name. There were days Tom walked behind the barn, alone, where no one could see him lower his head into his hands. He felt like a man carrying a rope that was already fraying. One more winter, one more accident, one more lonely year, and something inside him might snap. But he couldn't allow that. Not when Josie's eyes still looked for safety each time thunder rolled across the sky. Even the house felt it. The rocking chair no longer moved. The curtains didn't dance the same when the breeze came through. No one hummed in the kitchen anymore. The floors creaked not because of age, but because they missed footsteps that once belonged there. And at night, when the lanterns were blown out, the silence didn't settle. It haunted. Spring had begun to show its face across the plains, but the cold inside that home stayed stubborn, like it wasn't ready to leave. One late evening, while standing at the front porch with the mountains turning purple behind him, Tom made a decision no man makes easily. He would search for a woman to join the household, not for romance, not for passion, not even for companionship in the way people imagine. He needed stability. He needed warmth that stayed. He needed a mother for Josie, not a replacement for love. 3 weeks passed after Tom made his decision, and life on the ranch slipped back into the same quiet rhythm. Only now, every morning began with a glance toward the dirt road leading out to the distant hills. No letter arrived. No messenger stopped by. No rider brought news. But Tom waited anyway, as if patience alone could convince fate to cooperate. Then on a cold afternoon, when the sky looked bruised and heavy with snow, the sound of rattling metal and wooden wheels echoed down the narrow road. Tom straightened up from chopping firewood, wiped sweat from his brow, and narrowed his eyes. A wagon, old, dented, draped with a torn canvas, was dragging itself forward like it was carrying ghosts rather than people. Finally, he thought, his heartbeat rising with a mixture of relief and nerves. He tossed the axe aside, dusted off his shirt, and stood taller, trying to look like a man with his life put together, even if he knew deep down he was stitched together by memory and sheer stubbornness. But when the wagon creaked to a stop near the fence, reality split away from expectation. There was no pale-skinned woman in a Sunday dress, no neatly tied hair, no trunk filled with folded linens and sweet perfume. Instead, a young Apache woman stepped down from the wagon, her clothing layered with fur and worn buckskin, coated in dust and wind. Her eyes were sharp and alert, the eyes of someone who never allowed her back to face an open field. Black hair flowed down her shoulders in long braids, decorated with eagle feathers and bone beads, swaying like they carried stories older than the land itself. Behind her, 2 children climbed out slowly, so drained they could barely place both feet on the ground before pausing. A boy, thin but fierce, held the hand of a little girl whose face had lost all color except the purple shadows beneath her eyes. She pressed herself against the young woman's hip, trembling not from the cold alone, but from something deeper, something that made her shoulders flinch at every sudden sound. Tom stared, his breath caught halfway. His chest tightened, not in anger but in disbelief. "This isn't what was agreed," he muttered under his breath. The Apache woman stood silent, her chest rising and falling slowly, her gaze fixed on Tom as if evaluating whether he was danger or shelter. She said no greeting, offered no explanation. Her presence alone felt like a storm momentarily contained within a human form, quiet but heavy with threat and pain. Tom's mind raced. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This could bring trouble. Indigenous folks were rarely welcome near town, especially not staying under the same roof as white settlers. Rumors alone could spark fights, and fights on the frontier often ended with someone bleeding into the dust. He took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "You were sent here for marriage?" For a long moment, she stared. Then with a voice low and raw like wind scraping against bark, she whispered, "No." Only one word, but that was all it took for Tom's stomach to drop. He wanted to demand details, to shout, to turn them around and send that wagon rolling back into the hills. But then he saw her hands, shaking from exhaustion, cold and fear she was trying to hide. He saw the boy's jaw clenched tight, ready to protect without any backup. And he saw the little girl's fingers digging into the woman's clothing, as if letting go would kill her. Some truths don't require storytelling. Sometimes the body speaks clearer than words. Tom swallowed hard. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't want this. This wasn't the future he planned. But he could not as a father, not as a human being, turn away a trembling child into the cold dust road of Wyoming. He opened the gate with a slow breath. "Come inside, for now." The woman didn't thank him. The children didn't smile. The moment held no warmth, no relief. Just uncertain mercy, thin as frost, and a storm still waiting to break. The first days passed without a single word spoken from the Apache woman. Her name Tom learned only by hearing the little boy whisper it whenever he tried to calm his sister down. Ayanna. She carried herself not like a guest, and not like someone begging for shelter, but like a traveler who had learned to survive in places where kindness was rare and promises were worth less than dust. Inside the Brennan house, she moved quietly, with the posture of someone who never let her back face a door. She watched everything. The windows, the corners, the woods beyond the field, never lingering, but never unaware. The little boy trailed behind her, also silent, like a small wolf learning the world by smell instead of speech. The little girl, Annie, still clung to her like a shadow, afraid of being left behind by the single source of warmth it knew. Tom tried the first morning to offer instructions the way a man might speak to a new worker. "You can use the kitchen stove. There's flour and jerky in the cabinet if you need it." Ayanna simply nodded. No thank you, no complaint, no question. Tom didn't know whether to take that as respect or distance so thick it couldn't be pierced. Yet by midday there were signs, small but undeniable, that this woman didn't come to his land to rest. She headed straight to the fallen log pile without being asked, placed a wedge, and struck with the axe clean and controlled, as if the blade were an extension of her arm. She found the broken hinge on the barn gate and fixed it using a scrap of leather tied with a knot so tight it wouldn't come loose even in storm winds. Josie, who had been watching from behind the porch post, slowly stepped forward and asked, "How do you know how to do all that?" Ayanna didn't turn, didn't smile. She simply said, "Because it needed to be done." It was the first full sentence Tom heard from her. There was no pride in it, no explanation, just truth, plain and sharp. Later that evening, when Josie coughed again, the same persistent cough she had developed each winter since her mother passed, Ayanna quietly walked outside with a tin mug and reappeared with crushed roots, small green leaves, and a faint scent of pine. She heated water, steeped the herbs, and held the cup near Josie's hands. "This is warm for the body, strong for the lungs," she murmured. Josie looked to her father for approval. Tom hesitated, then nodded slowly. Within an hour, the girl's coughing eased and her breathing quieted. Tom watched Ayanna closely, but not with suspicion anymore, with real curiosity. This wasn't a fragile woman escaping tragedy. She was someone forged by it. But what unsettled him most didn't happen in the daylight. It happened once the sky turned black and the cold deepened. Each night, when the household settled into their separate corners of silence, Ayana stepped outside and built a small fire circle, carefully laid with stones, sage, and dried cedar she gathered near the river. She never built it large, only enough flame to breathe. Then she knelt, eyes closed, whispering words no one inside the house understood. The wind carried fragments of her voice across the yard. Soft, rhythmic, ancient. It wasn't singing. It wasn't praying the way church folk prayed. It was something older, something that felt connected to soil, to spirits, to grief, and to a promise she hadn't explained yet. Tom watched once from the window. Her silhouette bowed before the flame looked less like a woman and more like part of the earth, like she wasn't visiting the land. She belonged to it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. But while he didn't share her words, he felt them, deep and strange, as if the fire outside finally lit a corner inside him that had been dark too long. Curiosity turned into respect, slowly, quietly, like embers forming beneath ash. By the fourth day, the silence in the Brennan home was no longer just a quiet space between strangers. It became a warning Tom could feel but couldn't name. It wasn't only Ayana's silence now. It was the children's silence too. A silence shaped by survival, not shyness. The little girl, Annie, never spoke a single word. Not a whisper, not a cry, not even the smallest sound when she stumbled or coughed. Her eyes were wide and always searching, like she expected danger to slip through cracks in the walls. When Josie tried to play with her, showing dolls, drawing shapes in dirt, offering a biscuit, Annie only watched with the eyes of a fawn that didn't trust the stillness of the forest. Tom initially wondered if she was mute by birth or suffering from an illness. But the more he watched her reactions, the clearer it became. Her voice wasn't broken. It was hiding. Something had caged it. Something her young mind had locked away to keep herself safe. Then there was Samuel, the boy who stood like a guard dog rather than a child, clutching a small carved knife as if it were his last connection to control. He slept light, ate fast, and scanned every window like an outlaw expecting deputies to rush through at any minute. His hand never released the knife except when he bathed. And even then, he placed it on a nearby rock where he could reach it in 1 second flat. If Tom moved too quickly, Samuel flinched. If Tom spoke too loudly, Samuel tightened his grip. And if Tom walked toward Annie, even just to offer help, Samuel stepped between them like a shield made of bone and fear. No boy should have to learn the language of danger so early. But his eyes said he already knew every page of that handbook. Tom found himself torn between irritation and sympathy. He didn't ask for this. He didn't sign up for trouble. He certainly didn't want the law sniffing around his property. But he also couldn't ignore what he was seeing. These three were not travelers looking for a home. They were fugitives from something with teeth. That realization settled in fully one afternoon when Tom entered the barn to grab rope, but stopped short at a sound he'd never heard inside his walls. Ayana's voice, whispering low and fierce. Samuel and Annie sat beside her, in the hay, faces lit by a lantern. Tom wasn't close enough to hear the words clearly, but he recognized the tone instantly. She was giving instructions, not comfort. Rules, not lullabies. Warnings, not hopes. When she finished, she stood, sensing Tom before she saw him, as if her senses reached farther than human sight. Her gaze sharpened, not angry but protective. Tom exhaled, stepped closer, and finally asked the question that had been pounding inside his ribs for days. "You're not here for marriage, are you?" Ayana didn't flinch, didn't make excuses, didn't apologize. Her answer was calm, almost like it had waited a long time to be spoken. "No, we are not wanted, but we must live." That alone chilled Tom, but what she said next froze him in place. "I did not steal this child." Her eyes drifted to Annie. "I carried her spirit away from a place where it was dying." There was no tremor in her voice, no desperation, just clarity, like the kind spoken by someone who had stood directly in front of death and refused to step aside. Tom felt the barn walls close in, not from fear of her, but from what she implied. A place where a soul dies isn't a place someone runs from casually. You flee from it like running from flame, teeth, or chains. Ayana picked up a small pouch of herbs, tied it to Annie's wrist, then spoke without looking at Tom. You may think we bring you trouble, but trouble was already following us long before we reached your door. Tom didn't answer, didn't push, didn't judge. For the first time since they arrived, he saw them. Not trespassers, not burdens, not strangers, but survivors of something monstrous he couldn't yet picture. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he prayed he would never have to. By the end of the week, Tom could no longer carry the weight of unanswered questions. The air inside the house felt too tight, too heavy, like secrets were smoke thick enough to choke on. He had taken in 3 strangers, not just strangers, but fugitives. And whatever danger stalked them was now stalking him and his daughter too. So one cold night, while the wind rattled the shutters and the sky glowed pale with snowfall, Tom asked Ayana to step outside and talk. She hesitated, glancing toward the children, but finally nodded. Samuel watched them leave with the silent suspicion of a guard dog, knife hidden in his palm. Tom led her beyond the barn, across the frosted ground to an old birch tree, one his late wife once called the wishing tree. Its white bark glowed faintly under the moon, like a spine of bone rising out of the earth. They stood beneath it, the world silent except for the distant howl of something wild. Tom took a breath and forced out the words. "I need the truth," he said, voice steady but strained. "If you expect to stay here any longer, you have to tell me what happened and what you're running from." Ayana didn't look offended. She looked tired, a weariness older than her years, carved beneath her eyes like scars no blade made. She stared at the ground for a long moment before finally speaking. "My sister," she whispered, "was taken as a wife when she had no voice to say no." Tom froze. "Taken by who?" "A white man with land, horses, and silver," Ayana replied. "A man whose name carries more power in town than law or scripture." Her jaw sharpened as she continued. "He wanted a woman who would obey, a trophy he could break and display. She was never wife to him. She was possession. He fed her, clothed her, and locked her heart in a cage made of fear." The wind rustled the birch branches above them, like the tree itself winced. Tom swallowed, unable to hide the horror forming behind his ribs. "What kind of man?" he began, but Ayana cut him off with a stare sharp enough to slice. "A man this country respects," she said. "A man who speaks gentle in church and cruel behind doors. A man who knows no one believes the word of an Apache woman against him." She paused, breath shaking. "Her body survived longer than her spirit," she whispered. "But one winter night, her spirit left. Too broken to stay. Only Annie remained." Tom felt his heart thump painfully. "So, Annie is your sister's child," Ayana nodded. "When my sister died, I went to take the girl. Not out of theft, not out of revenge. Out of a blood promise made when we were children and braided each other's hair beneath canyon sun." Her voice trembled for the first time. "I did not steal her," she said, raising her eyes to meet Tom's. "I carried her soul away from the place where it was dying." The sentence struck him harder than any bullet could. In that moment, Tom saw not a mysterious runaway, not a burden, not a threat, but a woman who had walked through hell barefoot just to save what was left of her family. And behind her words, he saw Annie's silence, not as a puzzle, but as evidence. Tom's hands curled into fists, not at Ayana, but at whatever monster lived in that man's skin. Rage poured into his blood like kerosene, hot and sickening. He had doubted her. He had judged her. He had thought she brought danger. But now he realized danger wasn't following her. It was chasing what she refused to surrender. "I'm sorry," he finally said, voice rough. "No one should have to carry that alone." Ayana didn't cry. She simply nodded as if pain was something she accepted long ago. Like weather you can't outrun on the prairie. The moon above them glowed brighter, pale as forgiveness, cold as truth. And something between them shifted. Not friendship, not trust, but a fragile bridge made from shared loss. News in small frontier towns traveled faster than horses, carried by porch whisperers, saloon gossip, and the boots of men who liked to pretend they knew everything before the sheriff did. It didn't take long before rumors crawled from one end of town to the other. Tom Brennan's taken in a wild Apache woman. They say she's got kids that ain't hers. Could be trouble. Could be stolen. No one asked Tom. No one cared to hear why. On the frontier, fear always drew a crowd faster than truth. 2 days after Tom learned the full story under the birch tree, a lawman rode up the long dirt road leading to the ranch. His badge caught the morning light, and the dust from his horse's hooves drifted through the air like storm ash. Tom felt his stomach sink. Ayanna sensed it too. She moved the children inside without a sound, her hand resting near the knife she'd hidden by the door. The man dismounted, straightened his coat, and approached with a folded paper in hand. "Morning, Brennan," he said. "Got some business here." Tom forced himself to stay still. "What kind of business?" The officer unfolded the paper with unnecessary slowness, like dragging a knife before cutting. "This here's a warrant," he said, "for harboring an unregistered Apache adult and 2 minors without legal guardianship papers." The words hit Tom like a fist. "That woman and those children aren't criminals," he said, jaw clenched. The lawman shrugged. "Not my job to judge, just my job to collect." He stepped forward, but Tom blocked him. "You're not taking them." The officer placed his hand on his revolver. "Not drawing, just reminding. Don't make bad choices, Brennan." Before the tension could snap, a second sound entered the yard. Hooves, slow and confident, like the rider owned the earth he crossed. A tall, well-fed stallion emerged from behind the ridge, and upon it sat a man dressed in a dark wool coat trimmed with silver buttons, hair neatly slicked, and boots polished despite the mud. His smile cut across his face like something carved with a knife. Too perfect, too pleased. Tom didn't need an introduction. He knew who it was. The way Ayanna stepped backward confirmed it. Robert Holloway. He tipped his hat with poisonous charm. "Well now," he said, voice smooth as whiskey poured over ice. "Seems we finally found our little wanderers." Ayanna's face turned to stone, but anger flickered behind her eyes like fire trapped in glass. Tom stepped between them, fists ready. "You stay away from her." Robert raised both hands mockingly. "No reason for hostility, friend. I'm only here to retrieve what is legally mine." He pointed his gloved hand toward the house. "That child, Annie, is my property by marriage and by law. I have the papers to prove it." Tom felt heat explode through him. "She's a human being, not livestock." Robert laughed softly. "You speak like a man who doesn't understand how law works out here. Papers speak louder than feelings. And the law," he leaned closer, "doesn't bend for Indians or widowers." Ayanna finally spoke, voice low and steady. "You broke my sister. You will not break her child." Robert's smile vanished. His tone shifted from charming to cruel. "That girl belongs to me, and if you stand in my way, you'll be tied to her crimes." Crimes, that was the word he used, as if survival was a matter for chains. The lawman stepped forward again. "Hand them over quietly, Brennan. Don't ruin your life over people who ain't even your kin." Tom could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. He was just a rancher, not a hero, not a fighter, not a man who knew how to beat the law at its own game. He looked toward his house and saw Josie watching from behind the curtain, fear pressed against the glass. He realized then, if he surrendered them, he wouldn't only betray Ayanna, he would betray the last of his own humanity. But the world didn't care about righteousness. It only cared about who held the pen, the badge, and the gun. The hunter had found them, and he wasn't leaving without blood, compliance, or Annie. That night after Holloway rode away, with a wicked smirk and the lawman left behind a threat disguised as official procedure, Tom stood alone in the yard, breath turning white in the cold. He had never felt so small, just a widowed rancher with a failing farm, a hurting daughter, and 3 souls suddenly depending on him as if he were a fortress. He didn't know how to fight lawyers, sheriffs, or men with pockets full of power, but he did know what it meant to protect. He had buried a wife, survived blizzards, outlived hunger, and rebuilt barns with his bare hands. Hardship was no stranger, but this time the enemy wasn't storm or sickness. It was the law twisted by the wrong hands. The town turned against him faster than wolves scenting blood. Some muttered he'd lost his mind. Others called him Indian lover. A few predicted he'd end up in jail before spring thaw. But Tom never stepped back. He walked into the house, shut the door, and declared it without ceremony or pause. "We stand together. I'll speak for you." Ayanna blinked, confused at first. Men like Tom usually stepped aside, not forward. But his voice had no tremble, no hesitation. It was the sound of a man who'd finally found a cause greater than himself. They had 3 days. 3 days to gather proof, prepare testimony, and convince a courtroom full of white settlers that a native woman spoke truth over a wealthy man with a polished coat and perfect handwriting. That night, the ranch felt different, not safer, but united. Ayanna began gathering small woodland herbs, deer-hide scraps, stones etched with symbols, and a handmade satchel sewn with thread dyed from berries. Josie, still holding pieces of her complicated heart, tried to keep distance. Yet she watched every move the Apache woman made. Ayanna didn't force interaction. She simply lived gently yet fiercely, offering presence instead of persuasion. The breakthrough came quietly. Josie tore her coat sleeve climbing the fence, and instead of getting scolded, mocked, or ignored like she expected, Ayanna motioned her closer, kneeled, and spread out a piece of soft tan deer hide. No words, just patience. Thread made from sinew, stitches neat and steady like lullaby rhythm. Josie whispered eventually, "Why are you doing this for me?" Ayanna lifted her gaze, eyes reflecting torchlight and snowlight at once. "Because warmth belongs to every child, even those who believe they don't need it." The barrier in Josie cracked, not shattered, but opened enough to feel something other than anger. By the second night, Ayanna gathered Annie and Samuel near the fire pit behind the house. Snow flurried around them, melting on their hair like silent blessings. She invited Tom and Josie silently with just a nod. No pressure, no pleading. Samuel placed handmade charms around their necks, tiny woven talismans of river stones, crow feathers, and winter sage. Josie touched hers with steady fingers, not fear. Ayanna lit a small, controlled flame, using flint she carried from her homeland. The fire glowed low, no sparks, only heart-level warmth. Then she spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, but with the steady tone of someone speaking to both earth and heaven. "Truth is an arrow. If shot with fear, it falls. If shot with rage, it breaks. But if shot with purpose, it pierces every wall men build." Tom didn't understand the language she whispered next. Apache words rising like prayers, falling like promises. But he understood the emotion. She did not pray for victory. She prayed for courage. Josie, without anyone noticing, scooted just close enough so that her shoulder brushed Ayanna's arm. She didn't pull away. Tom felt it inside him. Hope and fear tangled together. Not the desperate hope people chase when drowning, but the quiet kind born from unity when darkness surrounds a shared fire. The trial wasn't held in a proper courthouse. There wasn't one for 50 miles. Instead, justice was summoned inside a small wooden church, its roof patched with tin sheets and its bell rope frayed like an old widow's hope. Snow piled knee-high outside, and every breath inside the chapel formed faint ghosts in the cold. The pews filled with townsfolk bundled in coats, not because they cared deeply about the case, but because drama was a warmer draw than winter chores. At the front stood Pastor Judge Willis, a tired-eyed man who served God on Sundays and the law on any day required. His gavel was nothing more than a Bible thumped against the pulpit. Tom and Ayanna entered together, but inside the chapel they were not equals. Tom was told to sit on the right side at the defense table. Ayanna and the children were ordered to remain behind a rope divider near the back wall, where the lantern light barely reached. Ayanna lowered her gaze without protest. It wasn't surrender, just the reality she had lived with since birth. The judge cleared his throat. "We begin. The matter? Custody, legality, and rightful guardianship of the minor child known as Annie Holloway." Tom clenched his fists but remained silent. Even the name used was a knife. Robert stepped forward in a tailored coat, looking more like a banker than a frontier settler. His boots shone, his gloves were clean, and his hair sat perfect under his hat, as if he had never seen hardship. Not the real kind. He began speaking with a tone made of syrup and lies. "Your Honor, good townsfolk, I come here not for vengeance, but for duty. My wife, rest her soul, fell victim to the cruel whims of a savage life she chose. I did all I could as a husband, offered her shelter, comfort, civilization." He paused dramatically, letting his words settle like poison. "When she died, I intended to raise her child as my own. But this woman," he pointed toward Ayanna without even saying her name, "abducted the girl, perhaps out of tribal superstition or hostility toward white authority." Murmurs filled the pews. Some nodded, some whispered figures. Robert's final blow was delivered with a sigh and a lowered head. I stand here grieving, not only my wife, but the family I tried to build. I ask only for what is lawful, so that my home may once again know order. Tom surged up from his chair. You're lying! The pastor slammed the Bible. Speak only when spoken to, Mr. Brennan. Tom swallowed his fury. Truth, like a horse, needed the right moment to run. The judge turned to Robert. You have documents? Robert produced papers from his coat pocket. Marriage record, land registry, and a statement signed by 2 witnesses claiming that the Apache woman had acted erratically after the death of her sister. All written neatly, all lined with authority. The judge scanned them slowly. Ayanna's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the memories trapped inside those letters. Tom looked back at her, then at the pastor, then at the crowd who already seemed convinced. Their faces said it all. Civilization always wins over those born outside its walls. When it came time for someone to speak on Ayanna's behalf, she was not called forward. She was not questioned. She was not even acknowledged. Native testimony is not admissible as independent proof, the judge stated flatly, as if reciting a rule about livestock. Ayanna lowered her eyes without tears. She had expected nothing less. Even Josie, watching from the back pew, felt her heart twist. She wanted to shout, to cross that rope, to say that Ayanna had saved her life, stitched her coat, prayed for her, loved Annie more than breath. But children were invisible in such rooms. By the end of Robert's performance, half the chapel nodded in his favor. Some even whispered prayers for his suffering. It felt like the final shovel of dirt already hovered above Annie's future grave. Hope, once warm like the fire outside their home, now flickered as thin as candle smoke. And though no verdict had been spoken yet, everyone felt the sentence tightening. Quiet, cold, inevitable. The church felt colder than it had when the hearing began, as if even the walls were bracing for a blow no one wanted to witness. Breath misted in front of every face, yet the tension was hotter than a poker fresh from the forge. The pastor-judge cleared his throat and lifted the Bible, ready to declare a verdict already carved in most minds. Tom's hands gripped the edge of the wooden table, knuckles white, breath trapped behind his ribs. Ayanna stood motionless behind the rope, her eyes lowered but unbroken, her entire body holding the quiet dignity of someone who had already tasted every shade of injustice. Annie clung to her skirt, silent as a shadow, Samuel watching the room like a cornered wolf. Robert leaned back with smug ease, one leg crossed, fingertips resting casually on his polished cane. He was relaxed, too relaxed for a man awaiting judgment. He smirked, as if smelling victory like a wolf scents blood. The judge drew in a slow breath. By the authority vested in me as both minister and legal, the church's heavy back doors slammed open. A blast of icy wind rushed inside, scattering hymn pages and making lantern flames whip violently. Townsfolk turned in their seats, startled. A man stepped in, breathless, snow clinging to his coat collar. His glasses fogged and his boots left freezing puddles on the wooden floor. It was Dr. Everett Peters, the town's long-retired physician. A man most believed too old, too tired, and too far away to matter in anyone's business. But here he stood, chest heaving, clutching a leather medical satchel like it held either salvation or judgment. Your Honor, he coughed, I request permission to testify. I have information concerning the deceased Mrs. Holloway and the child. A hush fell, heavy and stunned. Robert rose sharply. This trial is concluded. This is irregular and unlawful. The old man is mistaken. Dr. Peters' voice cracked with age, but not with fear. You will not silence me again. The pastor slowly nodded. Doctor, step forward. Hands trembling, Peters placed 3 items on the pulpit. A leather-bound medical journal, 4 sketch diagrams of injury patterns, a sealed written affidavit. I treated her, he said softly. Ayanna's sister, the late Mrs. Holloway. She begged me not to report her injuries because she feared what he gestured toward Robert, would do if the truth surfaced. He opened the journal. Page after page revealed contusions, burns, cracked ribs, and lacerations recorded over months. This was not illness nor accident. These are the marks of cruelty. She was terrorized, and when she died, she did not die from fever. A gasp rippled across the room. The judge swallowed. What caused her death, doctor? Dr. Peters shut his eyes, voice barely above a whisper. Repeated blunt trauma to the abdomen. She tried to protect Annie and took the blows meant for the child. Robert lunged forward. This is slander! Two ranchers in the crowd grabbed his arms, forcing him still. Peters continued, choking on his own breath. I was threatened. If I spoke, he'd burn my home and leave my wife penniless. I lived as a coward until today. Silence, a silence that carried the weight of a grave being uncovered. Then, Annie stepped forward for the first time since the ordeal began. With shaking fingers, she reached into her small hide pouch and produced a bead-woven bracelet. It matched one drawn in the doctor's journal, given to her mother on the night she vowed protection. Ayanna placed a hand gently over Annie's. No words were needed. Truth had spoken without language. The pastor-judge's voice trembled as he finally declared, Custody shall be granted to Ayanna. The court orders immediate detainment and full investigation of Robert Holloway. Gasps, then outrage, then relief, all blending into a storm of voices. Robert fought, cursed, and spat as cuffs were fastened. His polished boots thudded against the floorboards like a fallen tyrant's drum. When the doors closed behind him, the cold did not feel so cold anymore. The rope barrier was untied. Ayanna stepped forward, not triumphantly, but gratefully. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way grief had loosened its fingers from Tom Brennan's heart. Snow no longer screamed against the windows. It whispered. The wind outside didn't carry sorrow anymore. It carried smoke from a warm hearth, the scent of venison stew, and the soft stirrings of a home that was rebuilding itself one breath at a time. After the trial, no one dared speak openly against Ayanna or her children again. People still stared, still whispered, still measured them with eyes sharpened by decades of prejudice, but they no longer approached with threat. Some nodded politely, others avoided eye contact, and many waited to see whether the Brennan Ranch would crumble or transform. Tom didn't care which they expected. He cared who he became. One evening, with the sky painted mauve by sunset and the first robin calling from a distant pine, Tom cleared his throat at the supper table. He wasn't a man of fancy words. He never had been. But truth didn't need polish. It needed courage. You don't have to leave, he said quietly, not looking up at first. Then he raised his eyes to meet Ayanna's, steady and without hesitation. This isn't charity. It isn't debt. If you stay as family, not guests. Ayanna didn't answer right away. She glanced at Samuel and Annie, then pressed her palm over her heart, the Apache gesture for sincerity. The firelight reflected in her eyes, making them look like ember stones full of memory. Samuel nodded first, still cautious but no longer haunted. Annie leaned gently into Ayanna's side, small fingers closing around her dress fabric. And then Ayanna finally whispered, We have been running a long time. I think our feet can rest here. That night was the first dinner where no one ate in silence. Samuel told a story about a wild horse he once tried to tame. Josie shared how her mother used to sing when the storms rattled the rooftops. Tom added a memory of chopping firewood with his wife in their first winter. For the first time, memories were not chains. They were bridges. Later, when the moon was high, Josie surprised everyone by approaching Annie with a wooden whistle she had carved herself from a willow branch. Want me to show you how to use it? She asked gently. Annie hesitated, eyes wide. But Josie extended her hand without rushing, without pity, without pressure. Slowly, Annie placed her tiny fingers into Josie's palm, like a deer choosing to trust instead of flee. They sat near the fire, and Josie hummed a simple lullaby, just a tune she barely remembered from her mother, soft as cotton and slow as falling snow. Annie listened, then pressed the whistle to her lips, blowing a shaky little note. It wasn't clear, it wasn't strong, but it was sound. Josie smiled through a trembling breath. You can talk whenever you're ready. No one here will make you afraid. Ayanna turned toward the open doorway, watching from the porch as the two girls leaned against one another. Firelight flickered behind them, and for the first time since her sister's death, she did not feel like a survivor. She felt like a mother. She whispered into the night breeze, People are not born to share blood. They are born to find where their spirit belongs. Tom stepped beside her, snow crunching beneath his boots. It's good to hear a home breathe again, he said. Ayanna nodded. In my tribe, we believe fire remembers who sits around it. Inside, Annie whispered her very first spoken word since trauma stole her voice. Ma, not forced, not frightened, not broken. Just real. Tom closed his eyes and quietly thanked whatever power still cared for wounded families. And so the house that once echoed with grief now held songs, laughter, and soft footsteps. Proof that sometimes the world doesn't hand out miracles. It asks you to build them with wounded hands. Final line. Family is not born from blood. It is chosen by shared pain and rebuilt through love. Ending question for the audience. If life shattered your home, would you dare open your door wide enough for fate to rebuild it differently?